Hey everyone, Emily Jashinsky here with my colleague Kylee Zempel, assistant editor at the Federalist. We are coming to you to break down the news of the grand jury decision in the Breonna Taylor case with where some officers, the officers involved, were charged with wanton endangerment, but that's short of a murder charge. So it looks like there are rumblings of some dangerous and unsettled riots that are likely to break out in Louisville, wouldn't you say, tonight?
I can't imagine that they won't. Yeah,
Right.
just seeing what we've already seen in all of the cities. I mean, this is a really big deal. People have been, asking for justice for Breonna since March. So this is going to really crush some people, and I can't imagine that Louisville won't be overtaken in violence tonight.
Right. And Breonna Taylor, the point you raise is very important because Breonna Taylor's case has really been, I think, the most clear cut one that Black Lives Matter has latched onto over the course of the summer. And as I've been covering these protests, and maybe as you've been covering these protests, you were literally in Kenosha, and I've been outside the White House. Breonna Taylor is the name, honestly, that comes up. It seems to come up the most. Obviously, there's been George Floyd and Jacob Blake, but Breonna Taylor's name has been a constant throughout these protests. And I think some of that is because her case is, it's hard to look at without, being disgusted and sad about what happened. And I mean, that's true in all these cases when a life is lost, but Breonna Taylor's in particular because she wasn't involved in she was not accused of doing anything wrong.
Right. Right. So the New York Times came out with a piece that kind of painted a little bit more of a complicated picture of just Breonna Taylor's life. But unlike the George Floyd situation and the Jacob Blake situation, she wasn't really entangled in anything immediately leading up to her death. So it really does create a lot different picture than some of the other Black Lives Matter cases that we've seen over the summer.
Right, right. And this is a case where the no-knock warrant was issued, and this has incited, I think, a good conversation about proper use of no-knock warrants, if there is any proper use of the no-knock warrant. But basically, there was a no-knock warrant that was issued, and the police came in. The determination pretty much conclusively is that Breonna Taylor's boyfriend at the time shot first, and the officers were responding to that gunfire. He, however, shot first because he believed that there were intruders in the apartment, and so it was, self-defense per his contention. And so that makes this case extremely complicated, and I think it's one of those cases, as pretty much all of these cases turn out to be, wherein the due process system that we have in this country is so important, and we all learn a lesson on the value of it because these things need to play out in a court of law so all of the facts can come to the surface when we evaluate these situations through the trial by social media that we see so often, or the trial by cable news, whatever it is. It's not a very productive and constructive situation. So what we saw today with the grand jury ruling, it may not satisfy everyone, but at least we went through due process.
Right. Well, you bring up the no-knock warrant, and as my mind has just been kind of swirling with thoughts about this, I think so much of this really comes down to basically Breonna Taylor's boyfriend and whether he thought that it was actually an intruder or not, whether he heard the officers announce themselves or not. That's something that we really just don't have clear answers to, nor can we. It's really just a he said, she said. The officers say that they announced themselves. There was a witness that said they heard the officers. There were plenty of other witnesses who didn't, although at that time of the night, you can imagine that people didn't because they were asleep or not paying attention. But the answer to that question really determines whether the officers or Breonna Taylor's boyfriend were acting in self-defense. And that's just something that we can't have an answer to. I've seen a lot of people on Twitter reacting with, the walls of that apartment got more justice than Breonna Taylor because this wanton endangerment dealt with neighboring apartments and not with her life. And I can understand where they're coming from, but the walls didn't fire at the officers. And so there's this question of who was acting in self-defense and what was going through the officers and the boyfriend's mind at the time. And that's really what this comes down to.
Right. And these situations are often so complicated. This is one that I think is more complicated than most that we see. Although all of these cases really turned out to be so much more nuanced than they are when they first surface on social media. This is certainly one of them. But it's it's a complicated situation. At the end of the day, though, Breonna Taylor is somebody who wanted a better life for herself. She was an EMT. She was trying to become a nurse. At the center of all of this, excuse me, is her ex-boyfriend, who was involved in the drug world, and that's how the police ended up at her house that night. So it's a terrible tragedy that this young woman who had her life ahead of her and was excited to make a better life for herself, that her life ended this way. I mean, it's horrible, and we should be praying for her family that they might find strength in these moments. Of course, praying for the officers involved, for whom this is, I'm sure, not pleasant either, and maybe that they can exercise better judgment in future situations if it's necessary. But when we talk about these situations, and Breonna Taylor's case being at the center of the Black Lives Matter protests this summer, it's difficult to see that this was racially motivated. And these protests are against racism, and Breonna Taylor's name has been invoked repeatedly in the fight for equality against racism and discrimination. And I have not seen evidence that anybody acted in racist ways in this case.
I really haven't seen that in any of the coverage either, except how it's borne out in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the protests. But as far as police reports and people commenting on the case itself, I'm not seeing anything really about racial motivations here.
Right. And again, this happens time and again, where there are questionable, if not outrageous killings of young Black men and women, and they're tragic and they're wrong. But again, it's hard to, in some of these cases, see that outright racism motivated them. That's not to say that acts of outright racism don't still occur. Of course they do. But so often these cases that we talk about, it's really difficult to see where there was some sort of clear racial motivation. And I think that's what's frustrating about these conversations when they get sort of thrust to the center of our discourse, is that the nuance is kind of out the window and everybody's talking past each other.
Well, and we really could use nuance here, because if we could have a productive conversation, I mean, there really is a conversation to be had about no-knock warrants,
yes,
for instance. And so I believe it's Senator Rand Paul who's introduced some legislation to try to get these no-knock warrants to be banned.
That's his home state, by the way. Kentucky,
right. So if we could have a conversation about no-knock warrants, this could benefit people immensely in the rule of law, and as we try to uphold due process in America. But if we can't have these conversations because we're lighting cities on fire and making things about race that maybe aren't inherently about race, it inhibits us from actually pushing forward real change that this country could use.
Well, yeah, and a couple things. I mean, on the one hand, it makes people tune out and not believe the media when they hear these cases are being sort of framed as issues of racism. But on the other hand, one thing that we've discovered over the course of the summer, we haven't discovered this. This is good news. It's a norm in America to detest racism and to want to end racism. And that's one of the positives of those kind of vapid black boxes that were posted as an Instagram challenge earlier this summer that took over everybody's feeds. The positive, the upside of that, is that we are proud to be against racism in this country, and that it's socially abhorrent to be racist. That's a good thing. And so when we talk about issues like no-knock warrants, when we talk about some legitimate policy changes that can be made to our law enforcement departments around the country, everybody, Republican and Democrat, wants to protect police officers, and I'm talking about average people, by the way, not politicians who may want to protect their careers more than they want to protect the people of their districts or their states. But people can generally agree that we want to protect police officers and fight racism and protect people of all races at the same time. That means there's absolutely a huge appetite for any serious policy discussion that is going to make our police departments better for everyone, right?
That's right. And also, you mentioned everybody wanting really to fight racism as a general rule. It's like, we need to take away this racist veneer that covers all of our policy discussions, because it's really damaging all of our conversations right now. And we have to get rid of this assumption that if you're the one asking questions about policies, that you don't care about racism. If that's not the first thing you want to talk about in the wake of these tragedies, that thus you don't care about Black lives, you don't care about racial justice. There are so many nuances, and that we have to get that off of the surface.
Well, yeah, at the end of the day, that's such an important point, because that's exactly what makes these conversations impossible for us to have, is that like the left assumes that anybody who votes for Donald Trump is racist, and that is documented from a lot of leftist thought leaders time and again. It is essentially a formula that's taught on college campuses, which is that if you read like Ibram X. Kendi's books, there is no such thing as, being non-racist. There's only racist and anti-racist. And to be anti-racist, you cannot support Donald Trump, and they'll take that down the line. I mean, you can't support pro-life positions. You can't do like that. They will interpret that very broadly.
Well, and it's not just negative. It's also compelled. Not only can you not support, you must support.
You must.
Different tenets.
So that is such an important point. And again, that's why this conversation is basically impossible for our country to have right now, because anybody who engages in conversation and at any point dissents from the far progressive position, which has been mainstreamed and normalized by our cultural institutions, the corporate media, Hollywood, celebrity class, and academia, and actually corporations as well. If you dissent from that position at all, you are called racist. You're called a bigot, which again, like it's one of the worst things you can be called in this country that has a terrible history when it comes to racial equality. It's one of the worst. Nobody wants to be called that in this country, which is a good thing. It means there's social stigma and rightfully attached to racism. But you cannot have these conversations without inevitably being called a racist unless you are a full like Oberlin leftist.
Well, and we really should be prepared for all of this bigoted language to ramp up again. We're about to have the election. And just as we saw in 2016, I mean, if you supported Trump, you were labeled a racist. And I'm just prepared for half of the country to be smeared that way once again, depending on how the results bear out, which will be just detrimental to our ability to move forward and heal from these riots and just enact better policies leading into 2021.
Well, to wrap things up, Kylee, I want to ask, because you were in Kenosha, what people should expect to see in Louisville tonight and over the coming days. They've instituted a curfew, not just for tonight, but for the coming days. Now, what happened in Kenosha was basically this like explosion of protests over the killing of Jacob Blake. And this is going to be this is a reaction to the decision, which is a reaction to the death of Breonna Taylor. What should people expect, and what was your experience reporting in Kenosha?
Well, what happened in Kenosha was, I think the first night was basically peaceful, and then after that, things ramped up. I wouldn't anticipate that things will start peaceful this time. We've already hashed out the Breonna Taylor situation. This is round 2, so I can't imagine that things are going to start from a reasonable level. I think we can expect violence or riots and looting right off the bat. Beyond that, I just wonder what local officials are going to be doing as far as preparing for reinforcements and having increased law enforcement. It took a really long time for the National Guard to be called into Kenosha and for them to get the backup that they needed. So I hope that they're able to have enough officer presence, that private property can be protected. Private businesses don't have to fear. In Kenosha, many of the government buildings were protected right off the bat, the federal courthouse and other things. But, businesses right down the street were completely decimated. And so I hope that the local officials are prepared for what's coming so that those private citizens can be protected, because they're paying taxes and should have their property protected.
Well, an important thing that you and Evita Duffy reported on in Kenosha is you were going and asking people, locals, if they thought that the violence was coming from locals. And I imagine that Louisville should be prepared for people from out of town to descend upon their city at night in the next few days.
Yeah, so I don't know really the geography around Louisville. So we could anticipate that, because we're both familiar with Wisconsin and what happens with people coming from Illinois. I don't really know what that looks like around Louisville, but this is a national issue. It's insanely polarized. And so I think they should be prepared for out-of-towners coming into protest and possibly riot.
Well, we will keep an eye on this entire situation. Stay tuned to the Federalist YouTube channel. Subscribe to keep up with all of our coverage. Our prayers are with Breonna Taylor's friends and family, and with the friends and family of the officers involved. Kylee, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Emily.